The avoidant is experiencing something they've never allowed themselves to feel before. The sickening anxiety of being on the receiving end of distance they didn't create. You've stopped reaching out. You've stopped initiating. You've stopped doing the emotional labor that kept the connection alive despite their inconsistency. And now they're drowning in the very uncertainty they inflicted on you for months or years, except they have no framework for managing it because all their coping mechanisms are designed for being the person who creates space, not the person who suffers from it. The power dynamic they relied on has completely inverted, and the psychological consequences are tearing them apart in ways they never anticipated. For their entire relational life, the avoidant has operated from a position of control. They determined the pace of intimacy. They decided when to engage and when to withdraw. They held the power that comes from caring less, needing less, being less affected. This power wasn't conscious or malicious, it was survival strategy, the way they maintained safety in a world where vulnerability felt like mortal danger. But that power depended entirely on you continuing to pursue them, continuing to be the one who wanted more, continuing to bridge the distance they created. Now you've stopped. And without your pursuit to push against, their entire psychological structure is collapsing, the anxiety they've always triggered in others. The avoidant is now intimately acquainted with the specific brand of anxiety they've spent years triggering in partners. It's the anxiety of uncertainty, of not knowing where you stand, of wondering if you matter at all. It's the constant mental looping where you analyze every interaction for clues, searching for explanations that make sense of someone's absence. It's the obsessive wondering if you did something wrong, if you're being punished, if the connection meant less to them than it meant to you. The avoidant is living in this hell now, and every moment of it is teaching them what their behavior cost you. This anxiety manifests as complete inability to focus on anything else. The avoidant's mind is consumed with thoughts of you, with questions about why you've pulled away, with interpretations of what your silence means. They're experiencing the intrusive thoughts they've always triggered in anxiously attached partners, the kind that interrupt work and sleep and every attempt at distraction. You've become the center of their mental universe precisely because you've removed yourself from their life, and the irony is devastating. When you were available and pursuing them, they could take you for granted. Now that you're unavailable, you occupy every corner of their consciousness. The anxiety also includes physical manifestations they're completely unfamiliar with. The avoidant has spent their life regulating their nervous system through distance and control. But now they're experiencing the somatic symptoms of attachment anxiety. The tightness in their chest, the knot in their stomach, the restlessness that won't let them settle. Their body is responding to your absence as a threat, activating stress responses they normally only trigger in others. They're discovering that attachment anxiety isn't just psychological drama, it's a full-body experience of distress that can't be intellectualized away. What makes this particularly torturous for the avoidant is that they judge themselves viciously for experiencing these feelings. They've always looked down on people who get anxious in relationships, viewing it as weakness or neediness or lack of self-sufficiency. But now they're the ones feeling desperate for contact, the ones wondering why you haven't reached out, the ones experiencing the exact emotional state they've always considered pathetic. The shame of feeling this way is almost worse than the feelings themselves because it contradicts their entire identity as someone above this kind of emotional volatility. The desperate need to restore the power dynamic. The avoidance psychology is built on maintaining power through emotional distance. As long as they're the ones who care less, who need less, who can walk away more easily, they feel safe. But your withdrawal has obliterated that power structure. Now you're the one who appears unbothered. You're the one who seems fine without contact. You're the one demonstrating that you can survive and even thrive without them. The role reversal is psychologically unbearable because it exposes the avoidant to the very powerlessness they've spent their life avoiding. Every instinct in the avoidant is screaming at them to restore the previous dynamic. They want to do something, say something, reach out in some way that will make you pursue them again. They want to re-establish themselves as the desired one, the one with options, the one who has to be won over. But they're paralyzed by competing fears. If they reach out and you don't respond enthusiastically, it confirms their worst fear. They've lost the power permanently. If they don't reach out, they risk you moving on completely. Either option feels like potential annihilation of the self-concept they've built. This desperate need to restore power explains the confusing behavior many avoidants exhibit when they realize you've stopped pursuing. They might reach out casually, testing if you'll jump at the contact like you used to. When you don't, when you respond coolly or not at all, they're forced to confront that the old dynamic is dead. They might try breadcrumbing, offering just enough attention to see if you'll start pursuing again. When that doesn't work, when you don't take the bait, they experience another wave of powerlessness. Every failed attempt to restore the dynamic where they held control deepens their psychological crisis. The avoidant is also confronting the reality that power through emotional distance only works when the other person is still trying to close that distance. Without your pursuit, their withdrawal has no effect. They're learning that their primary relational strategy, creating space to maintain control, is completely dependent on someone else doing the work of bridging that space. They've never been powerful. They've been parasitic on your effort. And now that you've stopped providing that effort, their supposed strength reveals itself as nothing more than defended weakness, the shattering of their defensive narratives. The avoidant has always relied on specific stories to justify their behavior and protect their self-image. They told themselves they were just being honest about their limitations. They convinced themselves that people who wanted more were too needy. They believed they were protecting themselves from enmeshment and maintaining healthy boundaries. These narratives allowed them to be unavailable without guilt, to hurt people without accountability, to prioritize their comfort while believing they were being psychologically sophisticated. But your disengagement is destroying every single one of these protective stories. The primary narrative that's shattering is the one where you needed them more than they needed you. The avoidant operated on the assumption that you were more invested, more attached, more dependent on the relationship. This assumption made them feel safe. They couldn't be abandoned because you needed them too much to leave. But you've proven that assumption catastrophically wrong. You don't need them. You're functioning perfectly well without them. You've moved on, or at least moved away, and the ease with which you've done it is destroying their sense of being important or necessary to anyone. Another crumbling narrative is the one where their distance was justified by your supposed clinginess. The avoidant told themselves they needed space because you were too much, too demanding, too emotionally intense. But now you're not pursuing them at all, and they're discovering that your pursuit wasn't the problem. Your pursuit was the only thing making them feel desired and important. Without it, they feel invisible and irrelevant. They're confronting the possibility that they weren't creating healthy space from unhealthy neediness. They were taking for granted someone's genuine care while offering nothing substantial in return. The avoidant is also losing the narrative that they're fine alone, that they prefer independence, that they don't need partnership. When you were pursuing them, they could maintain this story because they had connection available whenever they wanted it. They could be alone by choice, knowing that ending the aloneness was always an option. But now the aloneness isn't a choice. It's a consequence. And experiencing imposed solitude rather than chosen solitude is revealing that they're not actually as comfortable alone as they've always claimed. The independence they prided themselves on was only comfortable when it was optional, when someone was waiting in the wings, ready to provide connection the moment they decided they wanted it, the grief of recognition. As the avoidance sits with your absence, they're experiencing waves of grief that keep intensifying. They're grieving the loss of you, obviously, but the grief goes much deeper. They're grieving the recognition of their own patterns and how those patterns destroyed something that mattered. They're grieving the wasted time when you were available and they were too defended to appreciate it. They're grieving the version of the relationship that could have existed if they'd been braver, more vulnerable, more capable of sustained intimacy. The accumulation of these griefs is crushing them. The recognition component of this grief is particularly painful because it comes with the awareness that this loss was preventable. The avoidant is seeing clearly now that they created this outcome through their own behavior. You didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because they trained you through their inconsistency and unavailability that caring about them brought only pain. You didn't lose interest. You lost hope that they would ever meet you halfway. The avoidant is confronting the reality that they destroyed something precious through their own fear and their refusal to work through that fear while you were still willing to be patient. This grief also includes mourning who they could have been with you. The avoidant is recognizing moments where they could have been vulnerable and chose defense instead. Instances where they could have communicated their fear honestly and chose silence. Opportunities to show you that you mattered, and they chose casual dismissiveness. All of these missed chances are replaying in their mind with the belated understanding of what was actually at stake. They're seeing that every time they chose protection over connection, they were choosing eventual loss. The grief of recognizing your own role in your suffering is particularly brutal. The avoidant is also grieving the future they didn't let themselves imagine when you were present. Now that you're gone, suddenly they can see clearly what partnership with you could have looked like. The domestic intimacy they were too scared to build. The emotional safety they were too defended to create. The life they could have shared if they'd been capable of sustained vulnerability. All of it is visible now in excruciating detail, and the visibility makes the loss even more painful because they're mourning not just what was, but what could have been if they'd been different. The realization about their own attachment needs. Perhaps the most psychologically destabilizing aspect of being ignored by you is what it's revealing to the avoidant about their own attachment needs. They've spent their entire life convinced they don't need people, that they're fundamentally different from others who crave connection and partnership. They've built an entire identity around being self-sufficient, around not needing the things that everyone else seems to need. But your absence is proving that this identity was a lie they told themselves to feel safe from the vulnerability of admitting need. The avoidant is discovering that they have all the same attachment needs as everyone else. They've just been suppressing them. The need to matter to someone, the need to be chosen and prioritized, the need for consistency and reliability in connection, the need to know someone is thinking about them and cares about their well-being. All of these needs are surfacing now in response to your withdrawal, and the avoidant is drowning in feelings they've spent decades denying they were capable of experiencing. They need you, and admitting that, even just to themselves, feels like psychological death. This realization is particularly threatening because it means the avoidant's entire self-concept was built on false premises. They're not actually more evolved or more independent than other people. They're not above the need for attachment. They're just more defended against it. They've been suppressing normal human needs and calling that suppression enlightenment. They've been running from vulnerability and calling that running strength. The recognition that their supposed superiority was actually just fear in disguise is humbling in ways that feel humiliating. The avoidant is also confronting the reality that their attachment needs might be even more intense than average, precisely because they've been suppressed for so long. When you finally allow yourself to feel needs you've been denying for decades, those needs emerge with overwhelming force. The avoidant is experiencing a hunger for connection that's amplified by years of starvation, and they have no idea how to manage these feelings because they've never developed the skills for tolerating or expressing attachment needs in healthy ways. The shame spiral. The avoidant is caught in a vicious shame spiral that intensifies with every moment of your continued absence. They're ashamed of how much they're affected by you not reaching out. They're ashamed of the anxiety they're experiencing. They're ashamed of wanting contact from you when they spent so long acting like they didn't want contact. They're ashamed of becoming the very thing they've always judged, someone whose emotional state is dependent on another person's behavior. The shame is paralyzing because it reinforces all the reasons they've avoided vulnerability in the first place. This shame includes the belated recognition of how they treated you. The avoidant is seeing their behavior from your perspective now, and the view is devastating. They understand now what it felt like to be on the receiving end of their inconsistency, their coldness, their withdrawal. They're experiencing the confusion and hurt they caused, and the empathy that comes from walking in your shoes is arriving too late to matter. The shame of recognizing themselves as someone who caused pain while believing they were just protecting themselves is almost unbearable. The shame spiral also includes self-disgust about their current behavior. The avoidant is monitoring your absence obsessively, thinking about you constantly, feeling desperate for any sign that you still care. This behavior contradicts everything they believe about who they are. They're supposed to be the unbothered one, the independent one, the one who doesn't need anyone. But they're discovering they're just as capable of desperate attachment behavior as anyone else. They've just never been in a position where their attachment system was this activated without an available escape route. The avoidant judges themselves harshly for not being able to simply move on. They tell themselves they should be fine, that they've been in this position before and always recovered, that you're just one person and there are others. But none of the usual dismissive self-talk is working because you weren't just one person. You were someone who mattered more than they let themselves acknowledge. You were someone they developed real feelings for despite all their defenses. You were someone they could have loved if they'd been brave enough. And recognizing that truth now is compounding the shame because it means they destroyed something rare through their own cowardice. The cognitive dissonance. The avoidant is experiencing severe cognitive dissonance as they try to reconcile their identity with their current experience. They've always believed they're the person who doesn't get affected by relationship dynamics, who stays rational and unbothered, who can take or leave people without real emotional consequence. But their current state contradicts all of these beliefs. They're deeply affected. They're anything but rational. They can't leave you in their past because you occupy their present constantly despite your physical absence. The gap between who they believe they are and what they're actually experiencing is creating psychological strain that's genuinely destabilizing. This cognitive dissonance manifests as constant internal argument. Part of the avoidant is trying to maintain their old identity by minimizing what they're feeling. I don't really care that much. I'm just curious why they pulled away. This isn't a big deal. But another part knows this is bullshit, knows they're devastated, knows this matters more than they want to admit. The two parts are at war, and the war is exhausting. They can't successfully convince themselves they don't care, but they also can't allow themselves to fully acknowledge how much they care, because that acknowledgement would shatter their self-concept completely. The dissonance also appears in how the avoidant tries to make sense of their feelings. They've always explained their relationship patterns as preferences and healthy boundaries. But if those patterns were truly healthy, why are they suffering so much now? If they genuinely preferred distance and independence, why does your distance feel like punishment? The avoidant is being forced to consider that maybe their patterns weren't healthy at all. Maybe they were maladaptive coping mechanisms. Maybe they've been running from intimacy rather than choosing independence. This consideration threatens their entire psychological framework. The desperation for resolution. The avoidant is experiencing a specific kind of desperation that comes from having no clear path forward. They want to reach out, but they're terrified of rejection. They want to explain themselves, but they don't have language for what they're feeling. They want to restore the connection, but they don't know how to do it without revealing vulnerability that feels impossible to access. They want you back, but they're not sure they're capable of being the person you needed them to be. The desperation of being stuck between incompatible desires is creating psychological pressure that has nowhere to go. This desperation drives them to construct elaborate fantasies about how they could fix things. They imagine perfect conversations where they finally articulate everything they felt but couldn't express. They envision scenarios where they prove through actions that they've changed. They rehearse apologies and explanations and declarations of feeling that they'll probably never actually deliver. These fantasies provide temporary relief from the desperation, but they also deepen it because the gap between what they imagine and what they're actually capable of doing just highlights their paralysis. The avoidant is also desperate to know what you're thinking and feeling. When you were pursuing them, they had information. They knew you wanted them, that you were hoping for more, that you were invested in the connection. But now you're a mystery. They don't know if you think about them at all. They don't know if you're hurt or angry or completely indifferent. They don't know if you've moved on or if there's any remaining possibility. The information vacuum is torture because the avoidance mind fills it with the worst possible interpretations, all of which confirm their fears about their own inadequacy and your justified departure. The permanent mark this experience leaves. Whether or not you ever re-engage with the avoidant, the experience of being ignored by you will mark them permanently. They'll never again be able to create distance without some awareness of how that distance might feel to the other person. They'll never again be able to take someone's pursuit for granted without remembering how it felt when your pursuit stopped. They'll never again be able to maintain their illusion of not needing anyone without confronting the evidence that they needed you and lost you because they couldn't acknowledge that need while you were available. This experience is teaching the avoidant lessons that intellectual understanding never could. Reading about how their behavior affects others is one thing. Experiencing it in their own nervous system is entirely different. The embodied knowledge they're gaining about the cost of their avoidant patterns is the kind of knowledge that can't be unknown. Even if they eventually suppress it, even if they return to their defensive narratives, somewhere in their psyche, they'll always carry the memory of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the distance they create. The permanent mark might lead to transformation if the avoidant is willing to use this pain as catalyst for change. The suffering they're experiencing could motivate them to finally do the deep work of addressing their attachment wounds, of developing capacity for vulnerability, of building skills for sustained intimacy. But it could just as easily lead to them becoming more defended, more convinced that caring about people leads to suffering, more committed to never letting anyone matter this much again. Which direction they go depends on choices they make in response to this pain. What's certain is that the tables have turned, and the avoidant will never be quite the same person they were before you stopped pursuing them. You've given them a gift they didn't ask for and probably don't want. The experience of their own medicine, the visceral understanding of what their patterns cost the people who care about them, the undeniable evidence that they're not actually above attachment needs or immune to relationship pain. Whether they use that gift to grow or to further fortify their defenses remains to be seen, but the gift itself is permanent. And so is the mark you've left by being the first person brave enough to stop chasing someone who wasn't running toward anything except away from themselves.